Welcome to today's episode titled Harley Davidson, The Rise and Fall of a Great American Brand. And it's the story of how two childhood friends more or less bolted a motor to a bicycle and then ignited a cultural revolution because, of course, over the next century, Harley Davidson became this symbol of rebellion, of freedom, and, of course, of America. But behind this myth, the company, it has had a turbulent time. There were strikes, near bankruptcy, Japanese rivals, political trade wars, and even Warren Buffett riding to the rescue. And today, Harley is still the most famous name in motorcycles. And yet, it's in dire straits. Its big bike sales have been dwindling, and its move to modernise has been disastrous. For example, it sold just 33 of its electric bikes in the last quarter. 33. So what happened? This is the story of Harley Davidson, and it's a cracking episode. Enjoy. So the story starts in 1903. Bill Harley was 23, a draftsman, and he had a simple idea. Put a motor on a bicycle, so no more pedaling. And Arthur Davidson, his childhood friend, he shared this vision. So the two of them, they squeezed into this tiny little shed, so small that a historian said it might have been where you put your worst mule. And they worked on a motor-driven bicycle prototype, and crucially, they persuaded Arthur's more mechanically gifted older brothers, Walter and Bill Davidson, to leave their steady jobs and to join them. And their first engine was, it was crude. It was a bicycle with a 7 cubic inch single cylinder bolted onto it, but it worked. Now, they weren't the first to do it. The Indian Motorcycle Company, which would go on to become Harley Davidson's biggest rival for the first half of the century, they launched in 1901. Arthur was the salesman, the two Bills were the principal engineers, stylists and everything else, and Walter became the president and general manager, and he set this tone of directness, of honesty. He'd also mingle with the riders, he'd listen to their comments and act on them, and, crucially, he personally put their bikes to the test by entering grueling endurance races to prove the bike's worth. And he won the Catskill Mountains run, 2 days over rough roads. A week later, he won a fuel economy contest, 50 miles on a single quart of gas. And those wins, they made headlines, and Harley started gaining a reputation for rugged reliability. And of course, this helped sales because they went from selling 3 bikes in 1904 to 50 bikes in 1906 to 450 bikes in 1908. And by 1912, Harley Davidson was turning out 10,000 bikes a year. And they moved to this massive 5-acre factory in Milwaukee. They had competition. Indian Motorcycles were outselling them, and there were dozens of other smaller manufacturers. World War I came along, and the US Army needed machines that could handle mud, sand, bad roads. Harley offered to help, and almost half of their production went to the military. And it was as a result of this that you have this link with the company and American grit and military prowess. So that was the beginning of Harley as this great American symbol. And by 1920, Harley Davidson was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, with more than 2,000 dealers in 67 countries. So you have police departments, postal services, commercial fleets. They all used Harley Davidsons, which is a surprise to me. I always associate Harleys just with bikers and biker groups, and we're going to get into that. But no, they were very much a practical bike used every day by all these government departments. So Arthur Davidson also, he pushed for community. He sent out newsletters to dealers. They'd give maintenance tips for customers. So the brand, it wasn't just all about sales, it was also about building loyalty. The competition was still fierce, but then came the Great Depression. That lasted from 1929 to 1939, 10 years. I didn't think it lasted that long. In my mind, the Great Depression ran for 3, maybe 4 years. So 10 years is brutal, and I'm going to have to do an episode on that. Anyway, it wiped out every single US motorcycle manufacturer except Indian and Harley. But even they were struggling big time. Like Harley's factory was running at just 20% capacity. So they took a big gamble, a huge risk in 1936, still in the throes of the Great Depression, when they launched the Knucklehead. It was this big, muscular but a beautiful bike with sweeping fenders, modern lines. It's such a nice bike, and still, it's very much a collector's item. One sold a few years ago for $220,000. And it was a huge success because it appealed to younger riders who wanted speed, power, and style. Now, throughout the 30s and 40s, second generation Davidsons and Harleys took on more leadership. William H. Davidson, Bill's son, he became the company president after his uncle Walter died in 1942. And there was a remarkable lack of infighting for a family firm. One reporter noted at the time, he said, "The organisation is thick with Harleys and Davidsons. However, there seems to be no feuding or fighting between them." Then came World War II, and Harley actually stopped civilian production altogether. The factory turned out 100,000 military bikes for the war. So by 1945, like a whole generation of soldiers had learned to ride a Harley. So that then after the war, with Indian motorcycle companies struggling, Harley dominated the US big bike market and demand was at record highs. But this presented Harley with a totally different type of challenge, because many of these ex-servicemen, they came home from World War II disillusioned and bored with conventional post-war life. Like, they just fought a war. And a lot of them were traumatized, but there was no diagnosis back then. And these restless, traumatized young men, they didn't want to wear suits and work a conventional 9-to-5 job. So they found the camaraderie and I suppose the adrenaline that they had shared during the war by forming motorcycle clubs like the Booze Fighters or the Pissed Off Bastards of Bloomington, and of course the Hells Angels, which was founded in 1948. And Harley Davidsons were easy to come by because of all the surplus army bikes. They could be bought for peanuts. Now, it should be noted though that there were actually biker clubs pre-World War II. These were made up of bike enthusiasts who didn't align with the values of the very conservative American Motorcyclist Association. And the actual biker gang called the Outlaws, they had been formed in 1935. Anyway, a defining moment for this whole biker subculture, it came at a motorbike rally in Hollister, California on July 4th, 1947. So crowds of bikers, they poured into the small town. There was a lot of booze, there was street races, there was a few fights and a few people went to jail, but newspapers really went over the top on this and they warned of motorcycle terror. And Life magazine, it ran what became this infamous but staged photo of a slouched beer-holding biker sitting on a Harley, empty bottles, littered around the wheels. And if you just Google Life magazine, Harley biker 1947, you'll see that picture. Now, Harley Davidson, of course, they'd nothing to do with organising the event, but the damage was done, kind of. I mean, in a way, this really helped Harley, but overnight, the brand found itself tangled up in this new image, the outlaw biker, and for a company run by church-going family men in Milwaukee, this posed a problem. Now, the conservative American Motorcyclist Association, they tried to contain it. Their president is alleged to have said, and I say alleged because there's no record of him actually saying this, but he's alleged to have said 99% of motorcyclists are law-abiding citizens. The other 1% are outlaws. And why this is important is because many motorcycle clubs then began to distinguish themselves by wearing the 1% patch on the jackets, and they continue to do so up until today. They're called the 1%ers. So Harley aligned, of course, with the 99%, but the image stuck, and of course Hollywood amplified this. In 1953, you had the movie The Wild One with Marlon Brando's famous sneer and his answer to the question, "What are you rebelling against? What do you got?" So that kind of burnt itself into the culture, and to most viewers, a big, loud bike meant a Harley, whether it was or not. The company itself, it fought back with ads showing clean-cut riders, police units, community events. But of course, like the rebel image, it had its pull, especially for veterans, and packs of black-jacketed riders on big Harleys became a sight that Americans recognised, and Harleys became an emblem of freedom, of individuality, and of this anti-authority attitude. So Harley was now a statement, and this sold bikes. In 1953, Harley hit its 50th anniversary, and that same year, Indian Motorcycle Company closed down after years of declining sales. And so, while Harley now had no US competition, it did have plenty of foreign competition from British brands like Triumph and Norton, who were producing nimble, stylish bikes that younger riders were taking notice of. And then in the early 60s came the Japanese manufacturers like Honda with affordable and reliable bikes. And Harley's heavyweight cruisers looked kind of old-fashioned in comparison. So to fight back, Harley took a 50% stake in Italian bike manufacturer Ermachi, and this gave them small 125cc and 250cc models to sell under the Harley names. Now, Harley purists, they kind of scoffed at this, but it was a pretty good strategic move to attract younger first-time riders. And at the same time, the Harley image in popular culture, it was only getting bigger, because you had Hunter S. Thompson's 1966 Hell's Angels book, and it painted this vivid picture of outlaw riders on roaring Harleys. And then, of course, in 1969, Easy Rider came out, and you had Peter Fonda's Stars and Stripes chopper. It became an icon. But despite its prominence in popular culture, the business side was straining. The Japanese imports were having a huge impact, and Harley's factories were aging. In 1965, the family took the company public, and the stock sale raised 20 million, which they used to modernise their factories, invest in new models. And even with these new models, sales kept slipping. By 1968, domestic numbers were half what they had been a decade earlier. The company was in big trouble, and that's when American Machine and Foundry, or AMF, stepped in. So AMF was this diversified leisure equipment conglomerate. They made bowling alleys and sporting equipment, and its CEO, though, was a Harley rider and a big fan. So in 1969, after 66 years of family control, Harley Davidson was bought by AMF. But, it became pretty clear early on that there were huge differences in the cultures of both companies. Like, the AMF playbook was one of speed up production, push more bikes out the door, cut costs wherever possible, while Harley Davidson was all about craftsmanship. So jobs were cut, morale sank, and in 1974 tensions boiled over after AMF moved the assembly line from Milwaukee to a plant in York, Pennsylvania, in a move to modernise production. It resulted in a bitter strike that lasted 3 months. And quality, once a point of pride with Harley Davidson, it just spiraled downwards. One engineer estimated that up to 30% of bikes rolling off the line were missing parts. And meanwhile, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, their bikes, which were much cheaper, were also famously very, very reliable. And the following figures give a good indication of how far Harley had fallen by now. In the late 1960s, Harley owned around 80% of the big bike market in America. By the end of the 70s, it was closer to 20% and sinking. And so by 1980, AMF, they just wanted out, but they couldn't find a buyer, which gives you a good indication of how precarious a position Harley was in. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him, and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months, again, for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, that's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story. But fortunately, there were still people who believed in the brand, and one of them was Willie G. Davidson, the styling chief in Harley, and the last of the founding family left inside the company. He was the grandson of founder William A. Davidson. And so in 1981, Willie G, together with Vaughan Beals, the motorcycle division president, and a team of 13 other executives, they put together $1 million of their own money and then lined up financing from Citibank, and they bought Harley Davidson for $80 million. So Harley Davidson was independent again. And while there was a huge amount of goodwill from dealers and the Harley community towards the deal, the new owners, they faced a massive challenge. The company had a product people no longer trusted. Demand was in free fall. The deal put the company in a huge amount of debt. And to top it all, the economy was in a deep recession. But in their favour, they had a management team that believed in the brand. And they had Vaughan Beals as their CEO. And hats off to Beals, because this guy did a remarkable job. So the first thing he did was to see what the competition was doing. He and his executives visited Japanese factories. Now, I have no idea how they got into these Japanese factories. I just couldn't find out. But anyway, they got in and they researched their methods, they dug deep, and what they found was a model of course, efficiency, like spotless floors, no rework stations, no piles of defective parts. As Beals said, it wasn't robotics or culture or company songs. It was professional managers who understood their business and paid attention to detail. We were being wiped out by the Japanese because they were better managers. So Beals and Harley adopted Japanese-style practices. Just-in-time inventory, quality circles, giving workers the power to stop the line if they saw a defect. And management spent months in town halls convincing union crews that this time quality came first. And then in 1983, they launched Harley's Owners Group, or HOG for short. And this was a way of building longer lasting and stronger relationships with Harley Davidson's customer. And this proved to be hugely successful, not just for building loyalty and community, but also for helping with development. Because on the product side, Willie G leaned into the Owners Group and into Harley's heritage. Beals and his marketing team, they recognised early on that baby boomers represented a massive market, because this cohort were eager to recapture, I suppose, a sense of youth and rebellion. So Beals, he pushed dealers to transform their showrooms, making them brighter, more inviting, and geared towards welcoming newcomers. They also made their bikes more comfortable. Now, despite all these changes, in those early turnaround years, Harley was still in big trouble. So they turned to Ronald Reagan and his administration for help. In 1983, Harley petitioned Washington, making the argument that the Japanese manufacturers were selling big bikes in the US at prices below what they were charging customers outside of the US. So President Reagan approved a 45% tariff on big imported motorcycles, giving Harley a 5-year breathing space to rebuild. Now, obviously, this was contentious. Japanese manufacturers, they were rightly arguing that Harley was using politics to compensate for their own failings. And I'm pretty sure, given Harley Davidson's culture, its heritage, that Harley's management team and almost every single Harley Davidson customer would have been free market proponents. So it's kind of funny that the people who would most likely be totally against any form of government intervention, and who would usually see this type of action as overreach or even as a type of socialism, are able to do an about-face when it concerns a company like Harley, and instead class these tariffs as the US government's patriotic duty. I think it kind of shows how most of us are willing to sacrifice our beliefs, or at least reframe them, given the right or maybe the wrong circumstances. But let me be clear, I think Beals was doing the right thing here. He was doing his job. Anyway, the tariffs, the changes brought in by Beals, all those things, they were working, because in 1984, the company returned to profitability. They posted a very small 2.9 million profit on 294 million in sales after years and years of losses. But despite these green shoots, Harley's main lender, Citibank, didn't believe that it had a future. This was mainly built on their belief that the company would flounder when the 5-year tariffs came to an end, and so Citibank pulled its financing, leaving the company teetering on the brink of collapse. And the board had actually started preparing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. But then, at the last moment, a Chicago-based lending company whose vice chairman was a motorcyclist and Harley fan provided them with a $49 million lifeline. Now, this allowed the company to go public again in 1986. They raised $90 million in total, and this allowed them to fund, new models. And a year later, Beals told the government to lift the tariff early. So a big success for Harley. Ronald Reagan travelled down to the Harley factory to announce it, and he praised Harley as proof, and this is of course, that American workers don't need to hide from anyone. Except of course they did. I mean, the tariffs allowed them to hide from their Japanese competitors. And look, I'm not criticising Harley here. Again, as I say, I believe Beals did the right thing by getting those tariffs. It helped save the company. So under Beals, Harley continued to thrive, and it capitalised on its heritage by reissuing these nostalgia models that tapped into the 1950s and 1960s styling. And as Beals said, it gave us a way to attract new customers and screw the Japanese. They didn't have anything like it in their heritage to go back to. And he's right. The company's marketing shrewdly emphasised what its Japanese competitors lacked, which was soul. And so the Harley mystique, that unique blend of outlaw image, of patriotic pride, it was fueling not just bike sales now, but also a hugely lucrative merchandising business. So by the end of the 80s, Harley had regained over 50% of the heavyweight bike market in the US. The Beals era, it came to an end, and you have to give him his dues. Together with, a tight management team, Beals helped turn around Harley and put it on a very, very successful path. And his heir, Richard Teerlink, who had served as CFO, he'd continued to build on Beals' success. So the 1980s, they opened with Harley Davidson in a position it really hadn't seen in decades, strong sales, healthy profits, a fiercely loyal customer base. The turnaround in the 1980s had worked, but now the challenge was different. It wasn't about survival, it was about managing the growth without losing the soul that had pulled them back from the brink. So Teerlink and styling chief Willie G. Davidson, they understood the importance of heritage, of quality, and of listening to your loyal customers. Willie G was on the road constantly. He was at rallies, he was talking face to face with customers, he'd sketch ideas, design ideas on napkins, he'd soak up the culture. And while many other companies were moving their manufacturing businesses abroad to save costs, Teerlink, he understood the importance of keeping Harley's production in the USA. He said, I think it's important for a company to have a heart and soul. When you start moving plants all over the world, you lose some of that. Now, just to clarify, I don't think it's true that every company's brand is tied to where their products are made. But for some brands, it is crucial. Brands like Harley, brands like Guinness in Ireland, Rolex in Switzerland, Ferrari in Italy. Anyway, throughout the 90s, Harley thrived. In 1998, they sold nearly 200,000 motorcycles worldwide. Revenues topped $3 billion. And it was a clear market leader in the US for large motorcycles with 56% of the share. And by 1999, the company openly stated that its biggest challenge now is to meet the growing demand, buoyed mostly, of course, by baby boomers who were reaching their prime income years, and they were happy to splash out $18,000 on a motorcycle. Now, I do need to put this success into perspective, because while it might sound like Harley at this stage was, one of the biggest motorcycle companies in the world, it wasn't. It was in terms of its brand, but in terms of actual bike sales, I mentioned 200,000 bikes sold in 1998. In that year, Honda had sold over 12 million bikes. So, just to put a bit of perspective on where Harley stood in terms of market size. So 2003 marked the 100th anniversary, and there were worldwide celebrations, and the marketing line was pretty clear. This wasn't just like a company's birthday. It was a century of American freedom on two wheels. Sales topped $4 billion in 2006, with 349,000 bikes sold. But demand was slowing. Gen X and the emerging millennials, they weren't as enamoured with heavyweight cruisers. And of course, Harley's core market, the baby boomers, they were getting older. On top of this, in 2007, they had a major strike. And then there was the 2008 financial crisis. And because in the 2000s, many Harley buyers financed their bikes, that model turned into a liability. Sales plunged. In 2009, Harley sold just over 220,000 bikes worldwide. That was 130,000 less than just 3 years earlier. Profits evaporated, like the company had to cut jobs, close off divisions, sell some core companies that it had previously bought. So it was in deep financial trouble. Now, it was saved by a $600 million private equity offering, half of which came from Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, and it was enough to stabilise the company. I did a bit of digging into this, and Buffett did very well from that deal. He earned an estimated $150 million profit by the time the debt was paid back in 2014. No surprise there, really. He doesn't make many bad bets, does he? Now, during these years, Harley expanded its international markets, and by 2017, foreign markets accounted for 40% of their sales. But sales were still flat. Like, Harley was still shipping about 1/3 fewer bikes than it had at its 2006 peak. And the CEO at that time, Matt Levitich, because Tearlink was well gone by this stage, as he said at that time, 20-year-olds today don't grow up wrenching in a garage. They grow up with iPads and video games. We have to reach them on their terms. And so in 2018, Levitich, he launched this plan, which is called More Roads to Harley Davidson. And it was a very, very bold plan, because this plan acknowledged outright that their older customer base couldn't sustain growth. And he laid out a plan for dozens of new models in categories that Harley had never been in before. Mid-size bikes, adventure tours, even electric bikes. But just as Harley was lining up for this pivot, global politics got in the way. In 2018, US steel and aluminium tariffs triggered a EU retaliation, including a tariff hike on American-built Harleys from 6% to 31%. What this in effect meant was that in Europe, which was Harley's second largest market, each bike cost an extra $2,200. So that is significant. Now, to protect its sales, Harley announced that it would move EU-bound production overseas to plants in Brazil, India. And on paper, it made sense. But, as you can imagine, politically, it was explosive. President Trump, who had praised Harley as an American icon, he tore into the company. He lambasted Harley on Twitter and in public remarks. He said, "I've done so much for them, and then they do this." He even called for a boycott. Now, Harley pressed ahead with new models, the most significant and successful being the 2018 launch of the Pan America. This was Harley's first adventure touring motorbike. It was a rival to BMW's GS model. Then, in 2019, it launched Livewire. This was this sleek, high-performance electric motorbike that could do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. Performance reviews were strong, but it was $30,000, and that price was too high, because the only ones who could afford that were older enthusiasts or wealthier hobbyists, not the new blood that Harley was trying to attract. As one dealer said, interest is very high until we tell them the price. So by early 2020, US sales were still sliding. They had actually been declining for 15 straight quarters. Sales in Europe were sluggish. So the board decided it was time for new leadership. So enter Jochen Zeitz. And he's a very interesting character. Like in 1993, he was made CEO of Puma, I don't know how you pronounce this, at the age of 30. Becoming the youngest CEO in German history to head a public company. Now, Puma was in huge financial difficulty at the time, and he implemented a long-term development plan that saw the company share price gain 4,000% over 13 years. He's also co-authored 2 books. One is this best-selling book with a Benedictine monk called The Manager and the Monk, a discourse on prayer, profit and principles. So Zeitz had this very impressive track record, and he scrapped the previous plan and replaced it with his own 5-year plan called Hardwire. And this was to turn the company around by doubling down on revamping its core touring lineup, as well as the Livewire electric motorcycle range. Indeed, at one stage, Seitz himself said that he would like Harley to eventually become 100% electric, which would be very contentious to Harley's very loyal customer base. Seitz also laid off 14% of the workforce. He cut the number of bike models by a third. He quit dozens of markets. He tightly managed inventory. But it doesn't look like his plan has worked. I mean, in 2024, Harley sold just 150,000 bikes. Remember, like even in the year after the 2008 crash, they sold 220,000 bikes. And Livewire, the electric bike, which was spun off as a separate entity, that sold just 33 bikes in the first quarter of 2025. 33 bikes, and it lost $20 million. And when you compare Harley to the likes of Honda, which sold 20 million bikes in 2024, Harley doesn't even come close to the top 10 of top motorcycle companies in terms of sales. And yes, it's probably still the most well-known and recognised motorcycle brand in many countries, indeed worldwide. So where can Harley Davidson go from here? I mean, it's in a precarious position. On the one hand, it's this iconic brand, known worldwide, linked to an idea of freedom, individuality and anti-authority. And that worked for many, many years, especially with the baby boomers who grew up watching Easy Rider, reading Hunter S. Thompson, dreaming of taking their hog out on the road at weekends. But those people, those baby boomers, they're gone. And over the last 20 years, as Harley tried to be everything to everyone, getting into touring bikes, into sports bikes, into electric bikes, they've diluted their brand, their heritage. And crucially, they've stopped listening to their loyal customers, the ones who genuinely love Harley. And I know you might say, well, aren't they all dead? I don't think so. I am pretty sure you can be guaranteed that there are young Harley enthusiasts who love the bike, not just for the image, but, lest we forget, for the big, beautiful chrome bikes that they're famous for. Harley Davidson need to lean into that. They need to go back to what made them great. And yes, I mean, they'll be appealing to a much smaller customer base, but a loyal one. And they can charge a premium for their big, beautiful bikes and then build on this. I mean, it would mean a complete reversal of their current plans. But they wouldn't have any competition. And they'd be staying true to their values. And for a brand like Harley, that is crucial. That is their main selling point. That is what Harley is all about. Heritage. Now, would this strategy work with the right leadership? Maybe. But if they don't do this, I think their decline will continue. And they won't be around in a few years. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. I love the Harley Davidson story because it's the story of an American brand, their rise and fall, their battle for survival, and how they can survive in a global market. It's what makes it a great business story. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like us to cover, email us at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.